Thank you very much. It's good to be back in the building where my youth basketball career actually started, just in the gym on the other side of that wall. It's good to be back. I usually go full screen with my slides here, but my projector is a little too wide for the screen, so you're seeing kind of under the hood of PowerPoint, so I apologize for that, but hopefully everyone can see this. So as mentioned here, I'm Michael Peterson. I'm a research analyst with the state of Minnesota's Demographic Center. So I'll be talking about sort of demographic changes that are really transforming our state. This is a pretty exciting time to be looking at demographics and how they're shifting in our state. So I'll be talking about that. Before that, just a little bit about our office and what we do. We serve as the liaison to the Census Bureau, and we assist with decennial census counts and other sort of data collection and outreach for the Census Bureau. So really sort of the boots on the ground in Minnesota for the Census Bureau. In addition to that role, we create our own population estimates every year for basically any area that contains people in the state. So that's all the way from the state level down to incorporated places, unorganized territories, and everything in between. We also do population projections currently through 2065. And that is typically done by age and race projections, things like that. So we really try to be useful for planning purposes in that sense. We analyze, we interpret, we distribute data from the state, the Census Bureau, and other sources. So we really try to be sort of a data clearinghouse and knowledge base for the state. In that capacity, we offer data and technical assistance to legislators, all levels of government, organizations, and really citizens across the state. We're open for business for people that need data. And that's all under the umbrella mission of our office, which is to monitor trends and help Minnesota make data-informed decisions. So just a little bit about what we do and what we're talking about today. So the first topic I want to cover, it's really crucial to looking at sort of the demographic picture in Minnesota and our country is aging. What you're looking at here is a kind of chart called a population pyramid. It's a pretty simple chart. So typically you split this by sex. So males are on the left, females are on the right, and then sort of older people at the top, younger people at the bottom. It's just a way to quickly observe sort of the age distribution of a population. So what you're looking at here is actually the United States in 1900. You see this does fulfill that name of a pyramid. It's really older people at the top and a healthy base, larger base of young people at the bottom, sort of replacing them and moving through the population pyramid, okay? So that's the nation in 1900. 1925, still looks a lot like a pyramid. Population growth across all age groups at this point. The country was really growing the first part of the 20th century. We get to 1950 and things look a little different. We got some smart people in the room here. Does anybody know why? Not exactly looking like a pyramid anymore? What's that? Baby boomers, that is correct. Baby boomers arrive on the scene sort of the late 1940s and really disrupt that sort of pyramid structure, okay? Look at 1975, now it really doesn't look like a pyramid anymore. And that's because we have our really large population of baby boomers in sort of their teenage years, early adulthood in the mid-70s. And then this is sort of the nation in 2000. This is sort of how a lot of people imagine generational, speaking in generational terms, by age group. Actually, in demography, we tend to not really use things like baby boomers, millennials, things like that. We tend to talk about age cohorts. We're a little nerdier in demography, but that's a lot of sort of how people think about these things. So this is what Minnesota looks like now. These are actually our projections made a few years ago for 2015. They look very similar to what we're seeing now. And now we have baby boomers, again, disrupting that pyramid structure and sort of solely a big bulge in the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s in Minnesota today. And what does that mean? The sheer number of baby boomers is so large relative to their other age cohorts. Tons of implications for sort of where the state's going. So what you're seeing here is the change in older adults, and in sort of census terms, that's sort of crudely drawn as people over 65, but there's certainly other ways to look at older adults too. So I'll be primarily talking about that group. So we're looking at gains in sort of the tens of thousands every year, people turning 65 and moving, again, up that pyramid. So for instance, in the 1950s, we had about 85,000 new older adults, and that's been pretty steady and constant up until the 2010s and 2020s. Things look very different. During this current decade, we're going to see 285,000 more 65-plus Minnesotans. 2020 to 2030, we're going to see an additional 335,000 65-plus Minnesotans. And again, if you'll notice, after that big sort of demographic shock, sort of how I think about these things, we're sort of back to normalcy on the other side of it, back to the sort of the tens of thousands in our projections. So I really want you to think about this as sort of a big demographic shock that's going to happen and then sort of recede, kind of like a wave, right? So just a different way to look at this is there are all the different age groups, some different age groups within that 65 plus population, all going to sort of grow in their share of the total population during this time. So in 2010, people over 65 were about 13% of our state's population. By 2030, they'll be about 21%, which may not seem like a big jump, but that is fairly massive in population terms. Things move relatively slowly with population growth and population change. So that's a huge, huge shift. Another way to think about this, for the first time in Minnesota history, we're going to have more 65 plus people than school-age children in Minnesota. Defining school-age children here as 5 to 17-year-olds, right? So sometime around 2020, not that far off, we're actually going to have a bigger, older Minnesotan population than we are young students. So important way to think about that. So there's a big byproduct here. With so many people leaving the workforce in a relatively short amount of time, we're actually going to see slowed labor force growth. So what you're looking at here is a chart of labor force growth as a percentage starting in the 1960s and then using our projections to go to 2045, okay? So we've enjoyed in Minnesota very strong labor force growth. And again, that labor force we really define as anyone between 16 and 64. That's sort of often considered to be the working age population. Certainly people work outside of those age groups, but that's kind of who we look to as the labor force. So we've seen 1%, 2%, almost 3% in the 80s, 1970 to 1980 growth, which is very high, very healthy, very typically considered very good. But we look 2015 to 2020 through 2030, we're down to more like 0.3, 0.1, 0.2% growth. So we're not actually going to decline as a labor force here in Minnesota, but that growth is going to slow, and that's really because so many people are going to be leaving the workforce in such a short amount of time. So really important to consider. Here's that same data just in total people. So again, in 1980, 1990, for instance, we gained 32,000 people sort of in working ages, right? 38,000 to 2,000. In the last decade, 25,000. While boomers are sort of leaving the workforce, we're looking at more like gains in 8,000, 4,000. And then again, return to normalcy, we're going back up on the other side of that big demographic shift. Question?
Do your projections include people who are here on work visas or student visas? Does it include people?
Yeah, so the question was, do our projections include people who are here on work visas, people who are coming sort of different paths to the future of Minnesota, right? I'll get to that, and if I don't answer your question, remind me at the end, because there's more on that to come, I promise. Very good question, though. So, I'm calling this sort of a challenge, maybe not a problem, but a challenge with our labor force growth slowing. But a reasonable response to that might be, are people working later in life? People don't retire as early as they used to. It's just less common, right? So what we have here are projected labor force participation rates for older adults using data from 1980 and then sort of our projections for 2040. And we do see and expect people of all age groups, starting with 55 up, with the exception of maybe 75 plus people, just working later in life, greater participation rates in the labor force. So that is definitely happening. And a way to think about this too, 65-year-olds were 10 percentage points more likely to be in the labor force in 2013 versus 2000. So that's changed in a relatively short amount of time. But I guess it's important to know, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, even with greater levels of participation among older Minnesotans, it's still not going to offset what we're seeing as sort of losses to the working population. So again, I'll get into what that means in a bit. Important to note here too that aging is not really what it used to be. Minnesotans, older adults, they're healthier, they're living longer, they're working longer than prior generations. Life expectancy for Minnesotans age 65 is now an additional 20 years, and that's 15 years in sort of what in the data we would see as relatively good health, so no major disabilities, things like that. Of course, there are variations across racial groups, educational groups. Not everyone is going to age the same, and there's different factors that affect how people age, right? But important note here too that Minnesota's boomers and current older adults actually volunteer in record numbers. We're second only to Iowa in the percentage of people over 65 plus who volunteer, which I actually think is a huge asset to communities. A lot of people talk about sort of the silver tsunami. That's what this problem is, right? But it's not all bad. It's important to note that there's some assets to our communities here too as a result of this aging trend. However, some important challenges I want people just to walk away considering here, which is that, are we going to have or create sufficient infrastructure for more transportation, caregiving, healthcare, social support needs, as we are certain health challenges and disabilities are going to increase, right? This is sort of inevitability of life. And this is especially true when children are far away. So it's something to consider when such a huge portion of our population is older. Are we going to be able to finance needed services, especially long-term care? Private and public medical expenses are going to increase considerably. That is a certainty at this point. And finally, that labor force piece. Are we going to have enough workers to form a strong, skilled, highly productive labor force? Right? We want to keep that sort of growth going, because if we agree that economic growth is a good thing and sort of a shared thing that we want to pursue, so there's two ways to do that, right? We can increase productivity or increase the number of workers. And a very easy way to do that is to have a growing population that can work. So that's why this is kind of a huge problem that we see. There's sort of a challenge, right? One moment. So another separate, though not unrelated trend for Minnesota is increasing diversity. And a lot of these things are true for the country as well, but I'm focusing primarily on Minnesota and eventually a little bit of data for this area and some of the cities around here. So Black, Latino, and Asian populations are growing rapidly. Our projections by race show that these groups are going to grow far faster than other racial groups in the state, including white non-Hispanics, who we often imagine as sort of the white population in census data. You see in 1960, for instance, all of these groups each totaled less than 50,000. So a pretty small share of our population. But since then, by 2010, they're really approaching, Black Minnesotans approaching 300,000. So growth has happened fairly considerably fast in the last 50 or so years for these groups. And that's going to continue. Again, that's sort of the trend. Here are the numbers. Looking at here's the blue bar is the 2010 census. The red bar shows our projections by race for 2030. So considerable growth for all of these groups. Even some of the significant increases we'll see in people marking 2 or more races, people who are multiracial. That's certainly going to increase too. And a lot of this has to do with age. So again, not totally divorced from age. And that's because a lot of this sort of increased diversity is happening at the bottom of that population pyramid. Okay, so this is just like that population pyramid I showed, just not split by sex. So it's just one half of it. But this shows the gold bar is the white non-Hispanic share of each age group. And the green bar are sort of everybody else, the people of color is often referred to, sort of a crude grouping of those people. But it's helpful to demonstrate this, which is that if you look at older ages, 85 plus, 80, 84, those are dominantly white non-Hispanics in Minnesota. This looks very different for younger age groups, down to the point where 30% of Minnesota children under 5 are people of color. Okay, so really consider, it's sort of obvious, but also not at the same time, is that these people who are under 5, 5 to 9, 10 to 14 are that future labor force. These are the people that are going to be replacing boomers as they leave the workforce. So important to consider how they're doing and what they look like as sort of workers in the future. And this is, if you're going to walk away with one thing that we're sort of seeing for the future, it'd be this. We'd reach a point where sometime in the early 2040s, we're going to have more deaths than births for the first time in Minnesota history. Just because that baby boom, again, cohort is so big, they're going to be dying off in a relatively quick amount of time. So that natural growth, the rate of natural increase or decrease, sort of a nerdy demography term, but that's just how a population is going up and down. So we'd reach a rate of natural decrease sometime in the early 2040s. However, when we look at total population projections that we produce, we don't see our population declining. And that's because we expect migration to be a big enough factor that our population will continue to grow even though we're having those losses. I'll talk about what that looks like here in a second. Migration, my third topic. So actually, this is a brand new report that we've looked at. We've not found anybody else who's looked at migration in this way before. So these are fresh findings, and I'm curious to see what you guys think. So we're looking at the two components of migration, which is international migration and domestic migration, which fairly obviously domestic migration would be people coming here or leaving to other states. International migration would be people leaving the country or coming from outside the country to Minnesota. And this is kind of interesting. There's a lot in this chart, so I'll break it down here. International net and domestic net, that's sort of just like If I move to France and then somebody else moves from France to here, that's a net of 0. We're just trying to figure out, are we gaining overall, considering who are we losing and who are we gaining, right? So we're just showing the nets here. The gold bar is domestic, the international is green, then the black line shows that total net migration. Are we gaining people or are we losing people once we consider all the factors? And what's very fascinating is that looking from 1991 to about 2001, we have positive migration domestically and internationally. And then suddenly a switch gets flipped in 2002 and domestic migration plummets. We actually, since 2002, have lost on average people domestically every single year. That trend continues to today. And I'll get into what those people kind of look like and what's going on there. Coupled with this sort of confusing thing is that while that has gone negative, international migration has increased significantly. You'll see those green bars are much higher than they were in the 90s. So, but you can definitely see as those gold bars go negative, it really drags that overall net migration line down. Okay. I do just want to take a moment to point out this is not unique to Minnesota. Midwestern states tend to lose more people than they gain, at least domestically. So this is a map I made just showing that net migration number for each state from the 2010 census to population estimates for 2014. So you see the big gainers here are Texas and Florida. And in fact, as of the 2014 population estimates, Florida is now the third most populous country in the state, overtaking New York State, which you can see actually lost a fair amount of population. So just important to note and think about this in context that this is not sort of unique to Minnesota. A lot of Midwestern states feel a similar thing. In fact, Illinois lost more people in that time frame than any state did. So important to consider that. Same map for international net migration. Every single state in the country had positive international migration across this time frame. And as you can see, a lot of the same states that have gained population have really been doing it via international migration. So a little bit about who's coming and who's going. What's sort of potentially drawing people to or from Minnesota. On the left, we have Minnesota arrivals at a glance. Each year, about 101,000 people move from Minnesota or to Minnesota from another state. Okay, about 100,000. About 19% moved from another country. 28% moved from a state that shares a border with Minnesota, and a little over half moved from a state not bordering Minnesota. Looking at Minnesota's leavers, a little bit more, 113,000 moved from Minnesota to another state in the U.S. 16% moved to Wisconsin, 12% to North Dakota, 6% to Arizona, 6% to Texas, and 6% to Iowa. So border states well represented there, obviously. Texas just seems to be drawing population from everywhere. I mean, their population's exploding. So that is not unique to Minnesota. One question you may be asking yourself or saving for the end would be that Arizona piece, are snowbirds represented in this, right? Everybody at least has anecdotal evidence of a peer, uncle, whatever it is, who spends half the year in a day in Florida and then the other half in Minnesota, or however that works out. And we get that question a lot, actually. It's difficult to find them in these data. And that's because these come from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, which asks sort of where do you live now and where did you live a year ago? And if we happen to catch them in Arizona, they just live in Arizona in the data. If we catch them in Minnesota, they just live in Minnesota. There's no specific question that asks, do you split residences? Do you have a seasonal home? Things like that. So it's kind of difficult to tell who they are and how prominent that is. But I do have a little bit about sort of how this migration looks by age. That might be a little bit illuminating in that arena. Interestingly, the largest net losses that Minnesota experiences are from people 18 to 20. This is sort of intuitive if you consider that young people tend to be more mobile generally. They haven't settled down yet. They don't own a home. Fewer obligations. They might just be going to school, things like that. And in fact, we found 1 in 4 people leaving Minnesota every year are students. So they're college-bound 18 and 19-year-olds. So I mentioned that this is sort of new data. We don't actually have an answer for what happened in 2002 when suddenly Minnesota students started leaving for other states for school. But they are, without question, the largest group among Minnesota's leavers, which is sort of interesting. We do see some increased mobility and sort of migration, people leaving the state in the sort of the early and late 60s. It really pales in comparison to students. So my perception is that if we're to trust what we're seeing in these data from people in their 60s, that the snowbird effect might be It's certainly real, it's a thing, but it might not be as prominent as people perceive it to be. But again, we just can't say with certainty what's going on with that group. But again, key thing to take away and something that was very unexpected for us were sort of people bound for college and graduate school going to another state. So again, an important piece of that migration, one component there is international immigration, right? And I just want to talk a little bit about foreign-born people in Minnesota. So after a bit of a lull in foreign-born population, across 2005 to 2009, about 7% of our state were people born outside the country. I just want to sort of characterize this. It's important to consider that previously, in sort of the beginning of our state, a lot of our culture, your Svens and Olis, right? A lot of that came from really intense international immigration to Minnesota in the beginning part of the century, where 20%, 15% of the state was foreign-born. So that dip happens sort of in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It's ticking back up, and it just sort of the face of that immigration looks very different than it did 100 years ago. Here we have the foreign-born population in Minnesota, largest groups by country of birth. And this may not surprise anyone that Mexico definitely leads the way. We also have in the top 5 Laos and Thailand, which is where you kind of represent foreign-born Hmong. They would be found in that group. India, Somalia, Vietnam, and then coming up on their tail, though, not too far, Liberians, Ethiopians, other people from Africa. So those are sort of the main groups that make up the foreign-born population in Minnesota. So I've got a little bit on some data sort of tailored and see what's going on for this sort of lower level and sort of the cities around Crystal, Brooklyn Center, New Hope, Robbinsdale, the 4 I focused on. So again, that population pyramid, once you get to lower levels of geography, tends to not look like a pyramid. Things can get a little zanier with the age distribution. So you can just quickly see these are the 4 cities I mentioned, and I'll get into each one specifically, but they do look very different, and some have a much younger population than Minnesota. Others are actually older than the state as a whole. So this is the population pyramid for Brooklyn Center, and a good way to quickly summarize what's going on with the age is look at median age. For Minnesota, that's 37.6 years, and Brooklyn Center is actually several years younger than that, 33.2. So that's a notably large difference in median age. Robbinsdale, a little bit older than Brooklyn Park, but those still, or about 1.5 years below Minnesota. Crystal, actually slightly older than Minnesota. And New Hope actually measurably older, 40.2 is the median age in New Hope compared again to that 37.6 in the state as a whole. So here we've got population change for each of those cities I mentioned from the 2000 census to 2013, and in the middle is that 2010 census. And you can see not a ton of change. Robbinsdale, New Hope, and Brooklyn Center all increased, but Brooklyn Center actually had the highest increase with just a little over 1,000 people gained since the 2000 census. So not a ton of change population-wise, at least when you consider size. But things look very differently when you look at them by race. So here we have Brooklyn Center's percent change by race. So this is the share of each group in the total population from 2000 to 2010. And the white share decreased dramatically. The white non-Hispanic population in Brooklyn Center in 2000 was about 20.5 thousand down to under 15,000 just 10 years later. So a significant decrease, down from 70% of the total population to under half. And that's the key point there is that Brooklyn Center, a few other cities are close, but Brooklyn Center is the only sort of minority-majority city in the state. So that's sort of how that's happening. And while they're the only city to really have that status, at least clearly in the data, the other cities I mentioned don't look that different. So that's the exact same graph. You can just see the trend is very similar. White non-Hispanic share, still the dominant group in these 3 cities, but the same trend is happening. Increases in those groups on the bottom, decreases in the share of the white population. So this is the most recent race data we have for these cities available. This would be sort of the average percentage across 2009 and 2013. So Minnesota as a whole is about 83% white. So while all of this is going to be happening in the future, changing dramatically, it's not quite there yet. white non-Hispanic still the dominant racial group in Minnesota, 83%. You look at Brooklyn Center, only 43% represented. And again, while Crystal, New Hope, Robbinsdale don't quite have that level of diversity, they're still sort of ahead of Minnesota, or have a smaller share of the white non-Hispanic population there as well. So a lot of the area does look very similar, just to varying degrees. So again, this is that same chart. I just removed the white non-Hispanics to take a little magnifying glass to those groups that are growing fastest. You can see about 5% of Minnesota's population across this time is Black or African American. That's compared with what is approaching a third of Brooklyn Center. And Crystal, New Hope, Robbinsdale are all in sort of double digits, so well above Minnesota's share. And again, those other groups, Hispanic and Asian, growing the fastest. So again, that same table of sort of country of birth for the foreign-born population for this area. So this is sorted actually for Brooklyn Center. So what you're looking at are the top countries of birth for people in Brooklyn Center. They aren't necessarily the same top ones in the other cities, but this is sort of these same groups looking at the other cities, if that makes sense. 23% of Brooklyn Center residents are foreign-born, compared with, again, that's 7% of Minnesotans. Minnesota is home to the largest U.S. population of Liberians, and about a fourth of that group are represented in these 4 cities. So very significant there. As you can see, remember, Mexico still clearly dominated the foreign-born population. For the state as a whole, it's almost equal, statistically undifferent, I should say, from Liberia. So that's a hugely unique thing that's happening here right now. And a good question then too is, if our black population is increasing, are those people from Africa? Is that a foreign-born population, or are those sort of domestically born black residents? So I looked that up. So a fourth of Minnesota's black residents are foreign-born. So growing, but still not the majority that you'll find. And that number is actually higher here. Among black residents in Brooklyn Center and New Hope, at least, about a third are foreign-born. So that's a big piece of that growth in that racial group, but it's definitely not most people growing, if that makes sense. And there's actually tons more I could have put together. There's a lot you can know about this community. So happy to take any questions you have after this point. And if you're sort of dreaming of demography, as I do at night, and you'd think of a question, I would encourage you to reach out to us. I'll have my email at the back here, but otherwise we do have a demography helpline that's monitored by everyone in our office. That's where we just take public data requests. Hey, I want to know median income for my city, or even things that are far more complex. We're happy to take those questions. So you can take down my email there. Feel free to email me, or that helpline, which you can find on our website. It's demography.helpline@state.mn.us. So.